Old black homeless. That's all Officer Miller and Chang saw when they saw Moses Johnson in his prison uniform. The harsh jeers echoed in the cold holding room. To them, the case was obvious. A poor old man caught driving a car that didn't belong to him. But was it really that simple? Why did the 68-year-old man's eyes hide a deep sadness instead of fear or cunning? Could his stoic appearance and silence hide a secret? A truth that could completely overturn all prejudices? The upcoming trial will not only decide Moses' fate, but also reveal an unexpected story that will leave everyone stunned. Join us in the courtroom and listen. Courthouse holding area breathed moisture into the stagnant air. The neon lights on the ceiling flickered wearily, casting a pale blue-white glow over the rows of metal benches bolted to the floor. Moses Johnson sat in one of them, his thin shoulders slumped beneath his loose orange prison uniform. He was about 68 years old, a black man with short gray hair, his face drawn with the deep lines of years and wandering. His eyes, though tired, were kind and resigned as they looked down at the calloused hands on his knees. He waited, silent, amid the footsteps in the hallway, the slamming of metal doors, and the distant chatter of the law's representatives. Not far away, leaning against the opposite wall, were two police officers on guard duty or waiting to testify. Officer Dave Miller, a white man in his late 50s with a beer belly and the permanent red face of a cranky person, was looking at Moses with undisguised contempt. Next to him was Officer Kevin Chang, an Asian about 15 years younger, with a more neutral face, but also showing no sympathy for the older prisoner. "Look at that old man, Kevin," Miller said, his voice loud enough for Moses to hear with a malicious intent. "Isn't he pathetic? He's probably thinking about what pathetic trick he'll pull in court. Stealing cars at his age. He's hopeless." Chang glanced at Moses, then shrugged nonchalantly. "Must have been desperate, Dave," he replied, his voice flat. "These people don't know anything about rules." Chang's words, though less harsh than Miller's, carried a subtle contempt, a generalization based on Moses's circumstances and perhaps his skin color. Miller sneered, a faint, malicious laugh. He stepped closer to the holding area, leaned against the bars, and looked straight at Moses, who was bowing his head. "Hey, buddy," he called, his voice sarcastic. "Are you going to cry and complain about your troubles later, begging the judge for mercy? Or are you going to make up a story about being driven by the devil to steal someone's car? Let me tell you, a lazy, parasitic person like him is the only place for him." He tapped the bars with his fingers, creating an unpleasant screeching sound. "You're not new to prison anymore, are you?" Moses Johnson remained silent. He simply bowed his head even lower, trying to shrink into the cold chair. But those standing nearby could see his thin shoulders tremble slightly. Not from fear, but from humiliation, the pain of having his dignity trampled by harsh words and cruel prejudices. He had grown accustomed to the contempt, but that did not mean it no longer hurt him. He could only endure in silence, waiting for the fateful trial that was about to take place, where the truth, whether it was heard or not, was the only thing he could cling to at this moment. The dry knock of the court clerk's gavel signaled the official start of the trial of State versus Moses Johnson. The atmosphere in courtroom 4 was solemn and somewhat tense. The dark wood-paneled walls, the American flag and the state flag hung solemnly behind the high judge's podium, and the tables and chairs for the lawyers, prosecutors, and defendants were neatly arranged. Light from the large windows shone in, but did not diminish the solemnity of the room. Judge Eleanor Vance, a woman in her 60s with gray hair tied in a bun and thin-rimmed glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, sat on the high podium, her face expressionless, but her sharp eyes observing everything that was happening below. On the prosecution side was Mr. Thompson, a middle-aged man in a neat suit, looking confident. Across from him, at the defense table, was Maria Garcia, a young public defender, intelligent but unconcerned. The case, at first glance, seemed simple enough and unfavorable to her client. The side door of the courtroom opened, and Moses Johnson was ushered in by a courthouse security guard. He walked slowly, limping slightly, looking small and out of place in his loose orange prison uniform. His eyes remained on the ground, avoiding the curious or pitying glances of the courtroom. He sat down in a chair next to Garcia, who placed a hand on his arm in silent reassurance. In the front row of witnesses and law enforcement, Officers Dave Miller and Kevin Chang sat there, backs straight, faces stony. Miller even smirked at Moses's appearance. To them, this was just a necessary legal formality to send the car thief to jail, where he belonged. After the preliminary proceedings were completed, Judge Vance signaled for the prosecution to begin. Prosecutor Thompson rose and approached the judge's podium. His voice was clear and articulate as he presented his case. "Your Honor," he began, "the defendant, Moses Johnson, is charged under Section XYZ of the State Penal Code with the theft of a vehicle, specifically a Ford F-150 pickup truck owned by John Peterson. This is a serious crime, punishable by a term of imprisonment of several years." Mr. Thompson continued to present the initial evidence that the police had collected. On the night of October 15th, at approximately 11:30 p.m., Officer Miller and Officer Chang of the City Police Department observed the defendant operating the aforementioned truck in a suspicious condition. The truck had previously been reported missing by the legal owner, Mr. Peterson. When stopped, the defendant was unable to produce valid documentation proving ownership or use of the vehicle. The defendant also failed to provide a reasonable explanation for his actions at the time of arrest. The prosecutor called Officer Miller to the stand first. Miller took the stand with a confident air. He recounted the discovery of the swerving truck, the stop, and Moses's arrest. He made a point of noting Moses' slovenly, dirty appearance and his confused, devious demeanor during his initial questioning. "The defendant looked suspicious, Your Honor," Miller said firmly. "He couldn't explain why he was driving that car. He was hesitating and looking away. He was obviously guilty." Next, Officer Chang was also called. His testimony essentially echoed what Miller had said, confirming Moses's arrest and suspicious demeanor. While not as scathing as Miller's, Chang's testimony also served to further cement Moses Johnson's image as a clear criminal. The prosecution's presentation ended, leaving the courtroom with the impression that this was a fairly straightforward case. A homeless, destitute man had stolen a car and was caught red-handed. Moses's prospects of defending him seemed slim. Attorney Maria Garcia clutched the file in her hands, feeling the pressure. After Prosecutor Thompson finished his presentation and cross-examined his witnesses, Judge Vance turned to the defense table. "Ms. Garcia, it's your turn." Public Defender Maria Garcia took a deep breath and stood up. She was a young lawyer, just a few years out of law school, full of enthusiasm but also aware of the difficulties of defending poor, vulnerable clients like Mr. Moses. The case on the surface seemed to be settled. The physical evidence against her client was quite clear. But she believed that behind every case, behind every person, there was always a story that needed to be heard. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and confident, "we do not deny that Moses Johnson drove a Ford F-150 on the night of October 15th without the owner's permission. However, the circumstances that led to his actions are far different than what the prosecution has presented. Mr. Johnson's actions were not motivated by greed or criminal intent, but by a desperate, selfless effort to save a life that was hanging by a thread." The young lawyer's opening statement caused a stir in the courtroom. Prosecutor Thompson frowned. Officer Miller and Chang looked skeptical. Judge Vance remained stern, motioning for Ms. Garcia to continue. "To clarify the facts, I would like to call my client, Mr. Moses Johnson, to the witness stand." Moses was led to the stand. He placed his trembling hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. As he sat down in the witness chair, he looked even smaller and weaker. "Mr. Johnson," Attorney Garcia began gently, "would you please tell the court what happened on the night of October 15th? Moses's voice was initially soft, shaky, and difficult to hear. He had to clear his throat a few times before he could begin his story. He said that he had been walking that night along Old Mill Road, a remote country road on the outskirts of town. He often picked up bottles along that road at night to earn some extra change. The road was dark, with no streetlights, just the dim light of the moon. A little after 11 o'clock at night, he said, his voice a little clearer, I was walking when I heard a very loud noise, like metal hitting hard, then glass breaking. The noise came from in front of me, not too far away. He followed the sound in the darkness. As I approached a bend, I saw a red car overturned in a deep ditch by the side of the road. Smoke was still billowing from the engine. He rushed down to the ditch. The car door was jammed, but I looked inside through the broken glass. There was a young girl sitting in the driver's seat, her head slumped over the steering wheel, blood running down her face from her head. She was still breathing, but her breathing was very weak. Moses described his panic. The area where the accident happened was completely deserted, with no houses or cars in sight. He tried calling out but got no response. He had an old prepaid cell phone, but when he checked it, it had run out of battery. I knew she was in trouble, he choked. There was so much blood. I was afraid she wouldn't last long. I tried to pull the car door open, but it was stuck. I found a big rock, broke the passenger side window, and tried my best to pull her out. He pointed to his calloused hands. My hands were cut by the glass and they were bleeding, but I didn't feel any pain at the time. After getting the woman out of the car, he helped her onto the side of the road. She was still unconscious, moaning in pain. I knew I had to get her to the hospital right away, but there was no one there, no way to call an ambulance. Desperate, he looked around. And then I saw it. About 50 yards away, across the street, there was a pickup truck parked. The lights were off. No one was around. I didn't know why it was parked there. Maybe the owner had gone into the woods to relieve himself or something. I don't know. But at that moment, I had only one thought. He paused, took a deep breath. I ran to the truck. The doors were unlocked, and fortunately, or perhaps ironically, the keys were still in the ignition. I have never stolen anything in my life, Your Honor. But at that moment, looking at the girl gasping for breath in my arms, I knew I had no choice. I had to save her. He went on to describe how he had managed to get Sarah into the passenger seat of the truck, then climbed into the driver's seat. I hadn't driven in years, and my license had expired. The truck was big and hard to maneuver, but I just kept driving as fast as I could toward town. I just knew I had to get to the hospital. He ended his testimony by being stopped by the police. When the girl was taken to the hospital and out of danger, I immediately went back to return the car and was immediately detained by the police. I tried to explain, but they did not believe me. They saw me driving a car that was not mine. They handcuffed me and took me to the police station. The courtroom was silent as Moses concluded his testimony. His story, though told in a shaky, tired voice, carried an indescribable weight. Prosecutor Thompson stood still, his face showing confusion. Attorney Garcia looked at his client with sympathy and trust. Judge Vance remained stern, but the way she looked at Moses had changed, no longer the coldness she had felt before. In the front row, Officer Miller and Chang sat frozen. Moses's story was completely different from what they had expected. If what the old man said was true, then they had treated a man who had risked his life to save another person horribly. An uneasy feeling, a doubt about their own actions, began to creep into their minds. After Moses Johnson finished his emotional testimony, the courtroom was still quiet. Prosecutor Thompson seemed a little flustered, and he asked a few cross-examinations, trying to find inconsistencies in Moses's testimony, but without much success. The old man's story, though hard to believe for a prejudiced person, was surprisingly consistent and truthful. It was Maria Garcia's turn to take the stand. "Your Honor," she said, her voice filled with confidence, "the story that Mr. Johnson has just told may seem extraordinary, but it is absolutely true. And to prove that, I would like to call my next witness, Mr. Robert Jenkins." A middle-aged man, neatly dressed in a business suit, stepped from the public gallery onto the witness stand. His face was still tired and worried, but his eyes shone with deep gratitude as he looked toward Moses Johnson, who was sitting at the defendant's table. After being sworn in, Mr. Robert Jenkins began his testimony. "Your Honor, I am Robert Jenkins, the husband of Ms. Sarah Jenkins." He confirmed that on the night of October 15th, his wife Sarah was involved in a serious car accident on Old Mill Road while driving home late from a business trip. Her car lost control on a curve and went into a ditch. "When we got the news and rushed to the hospital," he continued, his voice breaking, "the doctors said that Sarah's condition was critical. She had a traumatic brain injury, multiple broken ribs, and a lot of blood loss. The doctors said that if she had been brought to the hospital just 10-15 minutes later, maybe she wouldn't have made it." He choked up for a moment before continuing. "After a few days in a coma, thank God, Sarah woke up. When she was able to talk, the first thing she told us was not about the accident, but about the man who saved her life." Mr. Jenkins turned toward the defendant's table, looking straight at Moses. "She said that after the accident, she almost lost all hope when she found herself trapped in the car, bleeding non-stop and with no one around. But then, an old black man appeared like a guardian angel. His eyes were full of worry and determination. He tried to call for help but couldn't. Then he used all his strength, broke the window and pulled her out of the exploding car. Sarah said he helped her, covered in blood, to a nearby truck. She didn't know where the car came from, but the old man carefully placed her in the passenger seat, got into the driver's seat and drove away very fast. She said he wasn't a very good driver. The car kept swaying, but he didn't stop, just focused on driving towards the lights of the town. She passed out before she got to the hospital." Mr. Jenkins paused, looking at Moses with infinite gratitude. "Your Honor, that man, the hero who saved my wife's life that night, is none other than Moses Johnson sitting there." Mr. Jenkins's confident assertion caused a stir in the courtroom. All eyes turned to Moses, now no longer with suspicion or pity, but with amazement and admiration. "As soon as we learned the truth," Mr. Jenkins continued, "our family immediately contacted the police and the prosecutor's office to withdraw the report of the truck. The truck actually belonged to a kind neighbor of ours, Mr. Peterson, who left the keys in the car when he parked it on the side of the road to take a short walk in the woods. Mr. Peterson also had absolutely no intention of pursuing any charges against Mr. Johnson." Mr. Jenkins stepped down from the witness stand and walked straight to the defense table. He stopped in front of Moses, who looked up at him, his old eyes filled with tears. Mr. Robert Jenkins put his hand on Moses's shoulder, his voice sincere and emotional. "Mr. Johnson, I don't know how to express our family's gratitude. You saved my wife's life. You are our benefactor. We don't want you to suffer any punishment for that brave act. On the contrary, we want to thank you. We want to help you." The heartfelt thanks from the husband whose wife had just escaped death moved everyone present in the courtroom. The truth was finally revealed, as clear as the sun after the rain. The emotional testimony and undeniable confirmation from Mr. Robert Jenkins created a decisive turning point in the trial. The atmosphere in the courtroom changed completely. Doubt disappeared, giving way to understanding, admiration, and even remorse. Prosecutor Thompson stood silently at his desk, his face showing confusion and perhaps a little shame. He had built his case on the evidence and initial police testimony, completely unaware of the human truth lurking within. He signaled to Attorney Garcia that the prosecution would not be making any further counterarguments. In the front row, officers Dave Miller and Kevin Chang sat motionless, heads bowed. The true story of Moses Johnson's bravery, confirmed by the victim's family, was a blow to their consciences and the prejudices they had nurtured. Miller felt his face burn with shame. He remembered every insult, every act of ridicule he had directed at the old man in the holding cell right before the trial. He had treated a hero like a lowly criminal. Belated but profound remorse welled up inside him. He wished he could turn back time, that he had listened, that he had treated the old man with the least respect. Chang felt equally guilty. He had been silent, indifferent, even at times approving of Miller's wrongdoings. He had let his professional callousness, and perhaps his own hidden prejudices, cloud his basic human law enforcement compassion. He looked at Moses, then at Mr. Jenkins standing next to him, and felt a deep sense of respect and guilt. Attorney Maria Garcia rose, her voice now confident and emotional. "Your Honor," she began her closing argument, "what we have just heard is not just testimony, but a testament to the extraordinary kindness and self-sacrifice that can exist even in the most difficult of circumstances. Moses Johnson, a man with no home, no possessions, and no voice, did not hesitate to put his own safety and freedom ahead of the life of a complete stranger." She went on to cite legal principles. "The law is designed to maintain order and punish evil, but it must also recognize that exceptional circumstances, exigent circumstances, force people to act beyond their normal bounds. The exigent circumstances principle allows for an unlawful act to be excused if it is necessary and reasonable to prevent a greater and imminent harm. In this case, the death of Sarah Jenkins. Mr. Johnson's act of stealing the truck, she stressed, was not the act of a criminal, but the act of a reluctant rescuer, a modern-day Good Samaritan. He had no intention of taking possession of the vehicle, but only used it as the only means available to get the victim to the hospital in time. Once he had completed his purpose of saving the person, he stopped and had no intention of fleeing. She concluded with a powerful plea. "Your Honor, I believe that convicting Mr. Moses Johnson under these circumstances is not only an injustice to him personally, but also contrary to the humane spirit of the law. On behalf of my client, I respectfully request that the court acquit Mr. Moses Johnson completely." The courtroom was silent as Judge Eleanor Vance read the final verdict. She sat there, solemn on the dais, looking down at Moses Johnson with deep thought. She had heard many cases in her career, but this one was special. She looked gratefully at the Jenkins family standing next to Moses. She glanced at the two police officers with their heads bowed in the row below. Then she looked at the file in front of her. After a few seconds of silence that seemed to last an eternity, Judge Vance spoke. Her voice was solemn and clear, echoing throughout the courtroom. "The court has carefully heard the testimony of all parties, carefully considered the evidence presented and the relevant legal principles," she began. "There is no denying that technically the act of taking and operating a motor vehicle without the owner's permission is a violation of the law." She paused, then continued. "However, the law does not exist in isolation from the facts and human conscience. In this case, the court found that there were special circumstances that could not be ignored. These were the critical near-death situation of the victim, Sarah Jenkins. These were the remoteness of the accident scene, which made it impossible to seek help. And most importantly, these were the urgent, selfless actions of the defendant, Moses Johnson, which were intended solely to save a human life." She looked directly at Moses, her eyes now filled with warmth and respect. "The court recognizes and commends Mr. Johnson's extraordinary courage, compassion, and sense of duty. In a situation where many might have walked away out of fear or indifference, he chose to act, despite the danger to himself and the risk of breaking the law. Given the circumstances of the case, the defendant's legitimate intent to save lives, and the lack of intent to take property, as well as the lack of prosecution by the vehicle owner and the victim's family," Judge Vance continued, his voice firm, The court accepts the defense's argument based on the principle of exigency. She picked up the gavel. Therefore, the court finds the defendant Moses Johnson not guilty of the charge of motor vehicle theft. The sound of the gavel rang out decisively, ending the trial. A sigh of relief spread throughout the courtroom. Justice, this time, was not based solely on the dry letters of the law, but was also illuminated by the light of compassion and truth. Judge Vance's acquittal was like a cool stream of water that washed away the humiliation and injustice that Moses Johnson had suffered. He sat stunned in the dock for a moment, as if he could not believe his ears. Then, when attorney Maria Garcia turned to hug him with a radiant smile, the tears that he had been holding back for so long finally flowed. They were tears of relief, of emotion, and of happiness at having human dignity recognized. The Jenkins family could not hide their joy. They approached, and Mr. Robert Jenkins once again shook Moses's hand. "Congratulations, Mr. Johnson. This is well-deserved. You are a free man." Mrs. Jenkins, although still weak from the accident, tried to smile and thank the old man for saving her life. They did not stop at words. Mr. Robert warmly invited Moses to stay at his house, promising to help him find a light job suitable for his health and age, or at least a more stable place to live than under a bridge or on the street. Prosecutor Thompson approached the defense table, shook Garcia's hand, and nodded respectfully to Moses. "Congratulations," he said shortly. Even though he had lost, he felt relieved that the case had been just and humane. Meanwhile, at the back of the courtroom, Officer Miller and Chang quietly stood up and quickly left, trying to avoid eye contact. They didn't say a word to each other, but the silence between them was heavier than any argument. The shame and remorse for their actions and attitudes would haunt them for a long time. This incident would certainly be reported to higher authorities, and while no criminal charges would result, their actions, especially Miller's, would likely result in an internal investigation and appropriate disciplinary action. At the very least, they had learned a lifelong lesson about the dangers of prejudice and the importance of listening to and respecting all citizens, regardless of their appearance or circumstances. Miller's career would probably never be the same again. Moses Johnson, after receiving initial help from the Jenkins family and charities introduced by attorney Garcia, had a new start. He may not have become wealthy or completely free from the hardships of old age, but he had a roof over his head, a small job as a gardener at his local church, and most importantly, he had regained the dignity and respect he deserved. He was still his gentle, quiet self, but there was more joy and peace in his eyes. The story of Moses Johnson's trial, though not widely reported, has become a small legend told among public defenders, the homeless community, and even within the police department as a reminder of the power of kindness and the complexity of justice. It shows that sometimes the truth is hidden in the most unexpected places, and that the most seemingly weak and forgotten people can be capable of extraordinary courage and sacrifice. It is also a powerful lesson in the dangers of hastily judging others based on appearances, especially when racial and social prejudices are deeply ingrained. Officer Miller's actions and Officer Chang's initial indifference demonstrate how prejudice can lead to unfair and cruel treatment. But their late-breaking change of heart also shows that people are capable of recognizing their mistakes and awakening to conscience when confronted with truth and compassion. Ultimately, the story is an affirmation that true justice lies not just in the rigid application of laws, but in the ability to see, understand circumstances, motives, and the goodness of human nature. It provides a warm belief in the ability of the justice system, however imperfect, to deliver fair and humane judgments, restore dignity to the vulnerable, and honor acts of quiet courage. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. If you like this content, please click like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next meaningful stories, because tomorrow we will have another meaningful story for you.